Okay, so the second topic that we're going to cover today is new imperialism. Let's take a look at what new imperialism is. Uh, First of all, new imperialism mostly in this lecture is going to cover the scramble for Africa by the Western European countries. Now, all of these Western European countries got together in 1884 and had a Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference uh, divvied up by 14 European nations all of the land in Africa. Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, and also Jules Ferry, the French premier, were the main people responsible for putting together the Berlin Conference. As you can see right here, this is the imperial dimensions of Africa before the Berlin Scramble took place, and this is it by 1913. You have this large pocket in the northwest area of Africa that is basically French controlled. As you can see, the pink is widely controlled by the British, and the British wish to have a straight line from Cairo, Egypt, all the way down to the Cape of South Africa. Spain had some small holdings, and Belgium had this large area in the middle, the Free State of the Congo, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. Well, let's talk about what the methods of control were for this imperialistic mission into Africa. Basically, nations would have three different tactics based on their own mode. The British primarily followed the mode of having protectorates. A protectorate was ruled by local rulers. However, the Europeans controlled the military, foreign affairs, and the economy, and they intervened when imperial interests were threatened. Usually those imperial interests were threatened by other military threats from other neighboring colonies. An annexation is a direct colonial rule using European administration. So the Free State of Congo would be an example of an annexation. And then the sphere of influence would be an exclusive economic privilege for a European country, in which that one European country would be the only country that their products would be allowed to be imported, and all products exported would go to that European country as well. One of the problems with this imperialism is that there's a disregard for the indigenous people's history and conflict. Partly this has to do with a sense of privileging the Western European white style of civilization. Also, there's an exploitation of the indigenous people through labor and taxes. And what this did was this crippled the indigenous economy from ever really developing, and it harmed the working class folks very much so, to the point where many of them were treated pretty much just like labor that was dispensable. And then, of course, it erased centuries of culture because there was not care for preserving the history of these people. The Europeans came in and they arbitrarily created boundaries that made sense to them politically, but didn't make sense for the indigenous peoples and their tribal groupings. And so sometimes warring tribes found themselves within the same political sphere, and that created a lot of the conflict between the different parties. Uh, some of the features is a competition driven by nationalism, where you have these world powers that have been rising: Germany, Russia, Britain, and France. And the nationalism of those countries is trickling down into these new imperial colonies, especially since there are settler colonies where people are migrating, white Western Europeans are migrating to these colonies to establish the civilized Western European values and ideals, and those national values are coming with them. Along with that are their attitudes, which are going to erase any of the non-Western, non-Christian cultures and replace it with the Western Christian consumer culture and sports and politics. And then there are heavy issues that have to do with economics that we're going to get to in a second as we talk about Cecil Rhodes in particular. Cecil Rhodes was one of the most influential people for empire and for imperialism during the later parts of the 19th century. In 1880, he had migrated to Cape Colony in South Africa, and he became a minister of parliament. In 1888, he founded and formed De Beers Diamond Company. He was a very successful British businessman and financier and a mining magnate who took a lot of strategy in obtaining mineral concessions from indigenous tribal chiefs and accumulating a lot of the mines in South Africa. He was an empire builder that was a huge advocate for settler colonialism, and he believed that the Anglo-Saxon was the first race in the world. So a lot of people view him as being an architect for apartheid and one of the early white supremacists that came out of this imperialistic time period. One of the ideas that he promoted was the Cape to Cairo Road, or the rail line, or the red line, where there would be this just line of pink all across of Eastern Africa, so that there would be free trade routes and a free way in which British people could be able to engage in commerce all across the eastern side of Africa. From 1890 to 1896, he was the Prime Minister of Cape Colony and the leader of that colony. Another person that you need to be familiar with is one of the great villains of the 19th century. His name is King Leopold II. He was the monarch over Belgium. He ascended to the Belgian throne in 1865. And in 1878, he sent Henry Stanley to establish a colony in the jungles of the Congo. In 1885, the Congo Free State was established, which was an annexation. By 1890s, forced labor for rubber and ivory industry was in place. And because of that forced labor, there was it was a very strict and very vigorous and violent way in which the peoples were oppressed in the Free State of Congo. There was lots of beatings, lots of mutilations, and lots of killings in order that the quota production would be met. And so they would cut off an arm, which is a really bad idea, because if you have only one arm, you're just going to be able to produce a lot less. But they would do all sorts of horrible things to the forced laborers, in fact, killing many of them, seeing them as being dispensable individuals. There are estimates of about 10 million people who died as a result of this kind of economic and political policy by King Leopold II. This is a little excerpt from John Harris of Baringa, who was a missionary. He said, "I have just returned from a journey inland to the village of Insongo, Maboyo. The abject misery and utter abandon is positively indescribable. I was so moved, Your Excellency," he's writing to King Leopold II, "by the people's stories that I took the liberty of promising them in the future, you will only kill them for crimes they commit." One of the most significant works that was published really reflecting The political policy of Belgium in Congo was Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It was published in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine from the period of February to April 1899. So it was a serial publication of chapter by chapter that people could read. There's a introduction to it written by Cedric Watts in the Oxford World's Classic. And he says, in 1876, Leopold II, King of Belgium, had declared, to open to civilization the sole part of the globe which it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness which envelops the entire population. This, I venture to say, is a crusade worthy of the century of progress. In fact, primarily behind Leopold II's initiative for the Free State of Congo was a missionary venture to Christianize Congo and the peoples of Congo. That wasn't really what happened. What really happened was the mass exploitation of labor for the sake of gaining rubber and ivory, which was considered to be very valuable commodities for Belgium and for the rest of Western Europe. New imperialism continues to spread throughout the end of the 19th century, and as we get into the 20th century, we see that by imperialism, these four major world powers, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Russia, continue to accumulate more and more power, and that power mongering is all part of what led to World War I. So our next lecture is going to cover World War I.